The email arrived before Daniel Carter had even finished his first sip of coffee. Emergency executive meeting. Conference room B. Immediately. No explanation. No agenda. That alone felt wrong. For 12 years, emergency meetings had meant equipment failures, shipping delays, winter storms, supplier collapses. Problems Daniel was usually asked to solve. Just 2 nights earlier, he'd spent most of his weekend coordinating teams from his kitchen table to prevent a warehouse shutdown that could have cost the company millions. By Sunday evening, operations were back on schedule. He hadn't complained once. As he crossed the lobby that Monday morning, something else caught his attention. People weren't talking. Usually, the reception area buzzed with greetings, ringing phones, and the familiar rhythm of another workweek beginning. Today, conversation stopped the moment someone noticed him. A supervisor who normally waved every morning suddenly became fascinated by the papers in his hands. 2 employees stepped aside to let him pass, avoiding eye contact as if they already knew something he didn't. Daniel slowed his pace. A strange pressure settled across his shoulders. Outside conference room B, Vanessa Brooks from Human Resources waited beside the closed door. Her professional smile never quite reached her eyes. "Good morning, Daniel." He nodded politely. "Everything okay?" There was the slightest pause before she answered. "We'll explain inside." The conference room felt unusually crowded for an operational briefing. Vanessa sat near the end of the table. A company attorney Daniel had only seen twice occupied another chair, his leather folder already open. At the head of the table sat CEO Richard Hawthorne. Or rather, he sat facing the window. Richard didn't turn around when Daniel entered. That bothered him more than anything. For years, Richard had prided himself on looking employees in the eye, whether delivering praise or criticism. This morning, he seemed deeply interested in the parking lot below. Daniel remained standing. "I thought this was about the distribution issue." No one answered immediately. Vanessa folded her hands together, inhaled carefully, then slid a sealed envelope across the polished table. "Daniel, your position has been eliminated as part of company-wide restructuring." The words landed with surprising softness. For a second, they didn't seem to belong in the room. He looked from the envelope to Vanessa, waiting for the rest of the sentence. There wasn't one. "I'm sorry," she continued. "Today will be your final day of employment." Daniel blinked once. "I don't understand." "The decision has already been finalized. I was on conference calls all weekend. I know. We solved the warehouse crisis. We appreciate your contribution. Contribution, not years, not loyalty. Contribution." He finally opened the envelope. Inside were termination papers, benefit information, and instructions for returning company property before leaving the building. 12 years reduced to a stack of neatly printed pages. There has to be some mistake. The attorney quietly slid another document toward him. "There isn't." Daniel's eyes drifted back to Richard. The CEO still hadn't looked at him. Not once. Instead, Richard adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit and kept staring through the glass as though another conversation outside demanded more attention than the man whose career had just ended. A question formed in Daniel's mind before he could stop it. If this is just restructuring, why won't anyone look at me? The room became painfully still. Vanessa lowered her gaze. The attorney remained expressionless. Richard finally stood. Without turning around, he spoke in an even voice. "I wish you the best." Then he walked out through the side door. No handshake, no explanation, no thank you, just an exit that felt almost hurried. Daniel remained alone with HR. He signed nothing. He simply gathered the papers, removed his company badge, and placed it gently on the table. "I'll collect my things." Vanessa gave a small nod. "I'll have security accompany you." That surprised him. Security? It's standard procedure. Daniel almost laughed. Standard. After 12 years without a single disciplinary warning. The elevator ride to the operations floor felt longer than usual. A uniformed security officer walked several steps behind him, looking almost embarrassed to be there. When the doors opened, conversation stopped again. Co-workers stared at their computer screens. Others suddenly found reasons to leave the room. Only one person briefly met his eyes before looking away. It wasn't fear. It was guilt. Daniel quietly packed framed photos, a notebook filled with years of handwritten ideas, and the faded coffee mug Emma had painted for him in second grade. Across the room, he noticed another employee leaving with a cardboard box. Then another. Whatever was happening wasn't just about him. The layoffs had already begun. His phone vibrated. Emma, a picture message appeared on the screen. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, wearing the blue dress she insisted was lucky for school presentations. Can't wait to see you this afternoon, Dad. Promise you'll be there? Red heart. Daniel stared at the message until the words blurred. His fingers hovered above the keyboard before he finally typed. I wouldn't miss it for the world. He slipped the phone into his pocket, lifted the cardboard box, and walked toward the exit. As the glass doors closed behind him, he glanced back one last time. High above the lobby, Richard Hawthorne stood behind his office window. For the briefest moment, their eyes met. Then the CEO stepped away from the glass, as though he couldn't bear to be seen. Daniel made it to Emma's school with 4 minutes to spare. He left the cardboard box locked in the trunk, straightened the wrinkles in his shirt with the palm of his hand, and forced the kind of smile a 9-year-old would believe. Whatever had happened that morning could wait another hour. Emma had spent 2 weeks practicing her presentation. She deserved to see her father in the audience, not a man carrying the weight of losing everything. The elementary school auditorium smelled faintly of fresh paint and construction paper. Parents filled the rows of folding chairs, waving as children peeked through the curtain. Emma spotted him almost immediately. There you are, she whispered, racing over before her teacher could stop her. She wrapped her arms around his waist with enough enthusiasm to make him forget, if only for a moment, the envelope sitting inside his car. I knew you'd come. I promise. She pulled back and grinned. Don't blink during my part. I wouldn't dare. When the presentations began, Daniel clapped louder than anyone else. Emma spoke about the people she admired most, holding colorful note cards that trembled only slightly in her small hands. My hero, she said, searching the audience until she found him, is my dad. He fixes problems for everyone. Even when he's tired, he always keeps his promises. Daniel lowered his eyes before anyone nearby could notice the moisture gathering there. For those few minutes, the conference room, the termination papers, and Richard Hawthorne's cold farewell seemed impossibly far away. But reality was waiting at home. That evening, the kitchen table disappeared beneath envelopes. Mortgage payment, electric bill, insurance premium, another invoice from the hospital where Daniel's wife, Sarah, had spent her final months battling cancer 3 years earlier. Even after insurance, the remaining medical debt had followed them like a shadow, shrinking little by little with every paycheck Daniel faithfully earned. Now the paychecks had stopped. Emma wandered into the kitchen wearing oversized pajamas and carrying her favorite stuffed rabbit. Are those boring grown-up papers? The boringest. She giggled. Can we still get pancakes Saturday? Daniel looked at the stack of bills, then back at his daughter. Of course. It wasn't a lie. It was a promise he hadn't yet figured out how to keep. After Emma fell asleep, Daniel opened his laptop and updated his resume for the first time in over a decade. He sent applications to companies across the city, tailoring each one carefully. By midnight, he'd received nothing but automated confirmation emails. His phone buzzed. A message from Tom, one of the supervisors he'd worked beside for years. I'm sorry. Daniel typed back almost immediately. Do you know what really happened? 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Nothing. A minute later, another message arrived. I shouldn't have contacted you. Please don't reply again. Before Daniel could respond, the conversation vanished. Tom had blocked him. Daniel frowned, thinking it must be some mistake, and called another longtime co-worker. Straight to voicemail. A third didn't answer. Finally, a woman from payroll, someone he'd mentored years earlier, picked up on the second ring. She sounded nervous before he had spoken more than his name. I'm so sorry, Daniel. Can you tell me what's going on? A long pause followed. I can't. Why not? Another silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, We were told not to communicate with former employees involved in the restructuring. Involved. She realized what she'd said and stopped herself. I have to go. The line went dead. Daniel remained seated at the kitchen table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the room. He wasn't disturbed because he'd lost his job. Companies downsized. Markets changed. Those things happened. What unsettled him was everything that didn't make sense. Why escort him out with security after 12 spotless years? Why had Richard refused to meet his eyes? And why were people he'd trusted suddenly too frightened to speak? Across the hallway, Emma's bedroom door stood slightly open. A soft nightlight cast a warm glow onto the floor, and her school certificate from that afternoon rested proudly on her dresser. Daniel looked toward that light, then back at the unanswered questions scattered across his kitchen table. For her sake, he needed another job, but for the first time since walking out of the company, he began to wonder if finding work wasn't the only problem he needed to solve. Sleep came in fragments. Daniel spent most of the night turning over questions that refused to settle, but sometime before dawn another memory surfaced, one that had seemed unimportant at the time. 6 months earlier, he'd walked through Warehouse 3 during a routine inspection. Forklifts moved between towering racks, while crews prepared one of the company's largest quarterly shipments. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then he noticed a safety barrier missing from one loading platform. "What happened here?" he asked. A supervisor hesitated before answering. "Management told us to remove it. They said it slows production." Daniel stared at the open edge where a worker could easily lose his footing. "Put it back." "We were told not to." "I'm telling you now." The barrier was reinstalled before lunch. It wasn't the first time efficiency had been placed ahead of safety, and over the following weeks the pattern became harder to ignore. Inspection schedules were shortened. Equipment maintenance was postponed. Small incidents disappeared from internal reports as though they had never happened. Each decision looked insignificant on its own. Together, they painted a different picture. Daniel documented everything and submitted recommendations through the company's compliance system, believing concerns would be reviewed fairly. Instead, he received a meeting invitation from CFO Mark Ellis. Mark's office overlooked the city skyline. Every surface arranged with almost obsessive precision. Financial reports sat stacked in perfect alignment, while framed awards celebrated years of record profits. Mark greeted him warmly enough. "Daniel, you've always been one of our most dependable managers." "I appreciate that. That's why I want to discuss your latest compliance submission." He slid a revised report across the desk. Several safety violations Daniel had documented were gone. "So are the maintenance delays," Daniel said. "We cleaned up unnecessary language." It wasn't unnecessary. It was subjective. Daniel read through the pages again. Numbers had changed. Inspection dates had shifted. A near accident involving a forklift operator had been rewritten as a routine equipment adjustment. "This isn't the report I submitted." Mark folded his hands calmly. "It's the version being filed." Daniel looked up. "It isn't accurate. It reflects the company's official position." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Mark leaned forward. "You're excellent at solving operational problems. Let finance handle the paperwork." Daniel gently pushed the report back across the desk. "I can't approve something that isn't true." The conversation ended politely. The consequences did not. 2 days later, Daniel found himself sitting outside CEO Richard Hawthorne's office. Richard listened patiently as Daniel explained why the report needed to be corrected. When he finished, the CEO offered a thin, practiced smile. "I admire your standards. I just want the records to match reality. So do we. Then why change them?" Richard stood and walked toward the window overlooking the headquarters campus. "Leadership requires perspective, Daniel. Sometimes a technically correct report creates unnecessary complications. If someone gets hurt because we ignore those complications, they'll become very necessary." Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched employees crossing the parking lot below. "You build a reputation as someone who always does the right thing." "I've tried, and that's admirable." His voice remained calm, almost too calm. "But companies also need executives who understand the bigger picture." Daniel left believing the disagreement was over. Behind the closed office door, it was only beginning. Richard remained at the window as Mark stepped inside moments later. "He won't sign anything altered," Mark said. "I expected as much. We can still manage the reports." Richard shook his head. "No." He turned from the glass, his expression unreadable. "The reports aren't the problem." Mark frowned. "Then what is—" Richard straightened the cuff of his jacket before answering. "Daniel Carter. He isn't trying to cause trouble." "I know." "Then why worry about him?" Richard's reply came without hesitation. "Because men with principles don't stay quiet forever." Neither executive raised their voice. Neither spoke with anger. That was what made the conversation so unsettling. Daniel hadn't become their enemy because he had failed the company. He had become a liability because he refused to betray the truth. And somewhere beyond the safety reports, the altered numbers and the quiet meetings behind closed doors, there was a reason honesty had suddenly become so dangerous. By the end of the week, Daniel had applied for 23 jobs. Every morning began the same way. Coffee, job boards, cover letters tailored to companies that promised to value leadership and integrity. Every afternoon ended with polite rejection emails or complete silence. Employers who had sounded enthusiastic during brief phone screenings suddenly decided to move in another direction. It didn't feel personal. It felt coordinated. On Friday afternoon, Daniel drove past his former office on the way home from an interview. He told himself he only wanted to avoid rush hour traffic, but as a familiar glass building appeared ahead, his foot eased off the accelerator. Something unusual was happening. A moving truck stood beside the loading dock. Two security officers supervised workers carrying rows of gray archive boxes from the records department into an unmarked vehicle. They weren't transferring office furniture or computers. Every box bore the same printed label: compliance records. Daniel watched through the windshield as another stack disappeared behind the truck's metal doors. Why move archive files in the middle of a workday? And why under security escort? A horn sounded behind him, forcing him to continue driving. The image stayed with him long after the building disappeared in his rear-view mirror. That evening, another surprise arrived. Tom's resignation appeared on LinkedIn. "After 11 wonderful years, I've decided it's time for a new chapter." The announcement looked cheerful enough, yet Daniel knew Tom well. 11 years of loyalty didn't end overnight without a reason. Before he could finish reading the comments, another familiar name appeared. Then another. Within 3 days, for longtime managers had announced unexpected departures. None mentioned where they were going. None thanked senior leadership. It was as if people were quietly abandoning ship without saying why. Daniel closed the app and rubbed a hand across his face. Maybe he was connecting dots that weren't there. Maybe layoffs really had shaken everyone's confidence. Yet every explanation seemed to leave one uncomfortable question unanswered. His phone buzzed. The number wasn't saved. "You were fired because you wouldn't cooperate." Daniel stared at the screen. Another message appeared before he could react. "Don't call this number. Don't reply. Just read." His pulse quickened. Who is this? He ignored the instruction and typed anyway. The response came almost instantly. "Delete your message. They're monitoring company phones." Daniel frowned and erased it. Several seconds passed. Then another text arrived. "My name is Sophia Ramirez. Compliance Department." The name sounded familiar. He remembered seeing her during internal audits, though they'd never spoken for more than a few minutes at a time. "I can't explain everything over text. You need to know your termination had nothing to do with budgets." Daniel's fingers hovered above the screen. "Then why was I fired?" This time the reply took longer. Long enough for doubt to creep in. Finally, 3 short sentences appeared. "Someone is removing evidence. They're trying to finish before regulators see it. You were never the problem." Daniel read the messages twice. Then a third time. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen window, while Emma colored at the dining table, humming to herself without a care in the world. "Dad," she said without looking up, "do you think butterflies remember being caterpillars?" The question caught him completely off guard. He smiled despite everything. "I hope they do." "Why?" "So they never forget how far they've come." Emma seemed satisfied with that answer and returned to her drawing. Daniel wasn't. He looked back at the phone. If Sophia was telling the truth, someone inside the company wasn't cleaning up after layoffs. They were erasing something. He could delete the messages, keep sending resumes, and focus entirely on protecting the only family he had left. Or he could ask one more question. The trouble was, deep down, he already knew that once he did, there would be no turning back. Daniel didn't answer Sophia's last message. Instead, he turned the phone face down and sat in the darkened kitchen long after Emma had gone to bed. The refrigerator hummed softly behind him, and the rain that had drummed against the windows all evening had settled into a light, steady drizzle. He wanted to believe she was mistaken. People lost jobs every day. Companies restructured. Executives made cold decisions. That explanation was painful. The alternative was frightening. The next afternoon, another message appeared. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. Riverside Park. Bring nothing from your former office. Come alone. No signature. No further instructions. Daniel almost deleted it. Instead, he showed up. The park was nearly empty, wrapped in the pale light of an overcast morning. A few runners passed along the trail, and an elderly man scattered breadcrumbs for ducks near the water. Sofia Ramirez stood beside a bench, dressed in a plain gray jacket that made her look more like a commuter than someone who worked inside a corporate headquarters. She didn't offer a handshake. She glanced over both shoulders before speaking. "Thank you for coming." "You've got 5 minutes," Daniel replied. "After that, I need to pick up my daughter." Sophia nodded, as if she respected that answer. "You should know something first." She reached into her shoulder bag and removed a thick manila envelope. "I didn't take these because I wanted revenge." She placed it between them. "I took them because I couldn't watch them disappear." Daniel looked at the envelope without touching it. "What is it?" "The reports they didn't finish shredding." His expression tightened. "I thought you said evidence was being removed." "It is." "So why still have this?" "Because I copied it before security emptied the archive room." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Finally, Daniel opened the envelope. Inside were compliance reports, internal emails, maintenance logs, and spreadsheets marked confidential. At first, none of it made sense. Sophia pointed to a highlighted page. "Start there." It was one of Daniel's own inspection reports. His signature sat neatly at the bottom. Everything above it had changed. Safety violations he'd documented were gone. Equipment failures had vanished. Inspection dates had been rewritten. The report now showed full compliance. "I never approved this version." "I know. They used my signature. They copied it from your original submission." Daniel turned another page, then another. Every corrected report followed the same pattern. The original documents described delayed maintenance, missing safeguards, and operational shortcuts. The official versions painted an entirely different company. His name appeared on both, one truthful, one fabricated. A cold realization settled over him. This wasn't about hiding safety issues. Sophia slowly shook her head. No. She slid a financial spreadsheet from the bottom of the stack. Rows of figures stretched across multiple quarters. Several entries were circled in red. "I work in compliance," she said quietly. "I wasn't supposed to understand the accounting." "You did anyway?" "Not at first." She pointed to a series of maintenance budgets that appeared unusually low. They kept delaying repairs. Daniel nodded. "I remember. But the money wasn't being saved." He frowned. "Where did it go?" Sophia unfolded another document. This one came from the finance department. Numbers had been transferred between subsidiaries, operating accounts, and capital reserves through a chain of transactions that looked ordinary until viewed together. One total sat highlighted across the final page. $28 million. Daniel stared at the figure. "I don't understand." They reported maintenance costs that never existed. She flipped another page. They reported equipment purchases that were never delivered. Another page. They moved losses into accounts that investors wouldn't notice. Another. And every time your inspection showed real conditions inside the warehouses. She looked directly at him. Their financial story stopped making sense. Daniel felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. His reports hadn't simply documented safety problems. They had exposed a gap between what executives claimed was happening and what was actually happening inside the company. If regulators compared operations with financial statements, the deception would begin to unravel. He looked back at the stack of altered documents. So they changed my reports. When that wasn't enough, Sophia said softly, they decided it would be easier to remove the person writing them. The conference room. The attorney, Richard, refusing to meet his eyes. Security escorting him from the building. Tom's sudden silence. The archive records being hauled away. Every confusing piece of the past week suddenly locked into place with terrifying clarity. Daniel hadn't been laid off because the company could no longer afford him. He had been deliberately eliminated because his integrity threatened a $28 million fraud. He closed the folder slowly. If this is real, it is. They'll know someone kept copies. They already suspect it. And if they find out you came to me? Sophia didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the certainty she'd shown moments earlier. They won't just try to protect the company. She looked toward the empty walking path before lowering her voice even further. They'll protect themselves. Daniel slipped the documents back into the envelope, his thoughts racing faster than he could organize them. Across town, Emma would soon be finishing another school day, completely unaware that her father's dismissal had never been about budget cuts or restructuring. It had been the first move in a much larger game. And now, simply by learning the truth, Daniel had become something even more dangerous than an honest employee. He had become the one witness capable of proving that everything the company's leaders had built rested on a carefully engineered lie. Daniel hid the envelope beneath a loose floorboard in the hallway closet before Emma came home from school. He hated himself for doing it, not because he doubted the documents, because, for the first time since becoming a father, he was bringing danger into the same house where his daughter slept. That evening, Emma spread her homework across the kitchen table while Daniel cooked grilled cheese sandwiches. She talked about a science quiz, a classmate who wanted to trade lunch desserts, and the stray cat that had started waiting outside the school gates every afternoon. Ordinary conversations, ordinary worries. Daniel answered with the same warmth he always had, but his thoughts never drifted far from the hidden envelope only a few feet away. After dinner, Emma noticed him staring absently through the window. "You've been thinking a lot lately." He smiled faintly. "Have I?" She nodded. "Is it because you don't have to go to work anymore?" Children had a way of asking the questions adults carefully avoided. Daniel pulled out the chair beside her. "I'm trying to figure out what comes next." Emma rested her chin in her hands. "You always tell me that when something breaks, you fix it." He looked at her for a long moment. What if fixing it is really hard? She shrugged with the effortless confidence only a child could have. "Then you just keep trying." The simplicity of her answer stayed with him long after she'd gone to bed. He returned to the hallway, lifted the floorboard, and carried the envelope into the living room. If he stayed silent, perhaps the company would move on. Perhaps he would find another job. Perhaps Emma would never know how close they had come to losing everything. But every perhaps depended on pretending the truth didn't exist. Daniel opened a notebook and wrote a single date across the top of the first page. 6 months earlier, he began reconstructing everything he could remember. Every inspection, every meeting, every altered report, every conversation with Mark Ellis, every discussion inside Richard Hawthorne's office. He matched each memory with emails, calendar invitations, archived text messages, and printed performance reviews he had saved over the years. By midnight, his dining table had become a timeline instead of a dinner table. One event led naturally to another. Patterns emerged where isolated memories had once stood. The company's story was beginning to unravel under its own weight. The following morning, Sophia called from a number Daniel didn't recognize. "I can't stay on long." "Did something happen?" "They've started clearing offices." "What do you mean?" "Entire filing cabinets are gone." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "They're still destroying records?" "Not just paper." Her voice dropped lower. "Hard drives, backup logs, security footage older than 6 months." Daniel looked at the growing stack of notes in front of him. "They know someone is looking." "I think they know someone copied files." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Daniel asked, "Are you safe?" "I don't know." The answer lingered after the call ended. Over the next several days, Sophia quietly gathered what remained before it disappeared. She photographed maintenance logs that hadn't yet been altered, downloaded audit schedules scheduled for deletion, and recorded document identification numbers so investigators could later prove files had gone missing. She never took unnecessary risks. She moved carefully, understanding that one careless decision could destroy everything. Meanwhile, Daniel discovered something else. The company had issued a public statement explaining the layoffs. According to the press release, declining market conditions and rising operating costs had forced leadership to eliminate 85 positions in order to protect the long-term health of the organization. He read the statement twice. Every sentence sounded polished, responsible, almost compassionate. Yet Daniel now knew those words were carefully crafted to hide a very different reality. The layoffs weren't about saving the company. They were buying time. Time to erase evidence. Time to shape the public narrative. Time to make anyone who questioned the official story appear bitter or dishonest. Daniel closed the company's website and looked toward Emma's bedroom, where the soft glow of her nightlight spilled into the hallway. He had spent 12 years protecting a corporation that promised integrity. Now there was only one promise that mattered. His daughter deserved a future, where doing the right thing wasn't punished by those with the power to rewrite the truth. The risks were no longer limited to losing another job. The moment he stepped forward, the fight would leave the walls of corporate offices and become something much larger, legal, public, and impossible to quietly bury. The contact information sat on Daniel's desk for nearly 2 days before he used it. Sophia had written it on a small sheet of paper torn from a legal pad. No company letterhead, no emails, no digital trail, just a name and a number, James Whitmore. Below it, she had written 3 words, Federal Financial Crimes. Daniel understood what making that call meant. Until now, everything had remained private. Notes on a dining room table, copies of reports hidden beneath floorboards, quiet conversations held in parking lots and public parks. Once federal investigators became involved, there would be no way to pull back. The story would stop belonging to him. On Wednesday morning, after dropping Em at school, Daniel returned home, organized every document into chronological order, and checked each file one final time. Emails, compliance reports, meeting records, altered inspections, copies of financial spreadsheets, a written timeline connecting everything together. By noon, the evidence filled an entire folder. At 12:07 p.m., he dialed the number. The line rang twice. Whitmore. The voice was calm, direct, and impatient in the way only very busy people seem to be. "My name is Daniel Carter." A brief pause followed. "And why are you calling me, Mr. Carter?" Daniel glanced at the folder. "Because I think I was fired for refusing to help cover up fraud." Silence, not disbelief. Attention. The kind that instantly changes the atmosphere of a conversation. "Start at the beginning," Whitmore said. Daniel did. For nearly an hour, he walked through every event he could document. The altered compliance reports, the safety violations, the financial inconsistencies, the layoffs, the destruction of records, the executives who had pressured him to approve inaccurate documents. He avoided exaggeration, avoided assumptions. Whenever he wasn't certain of something, he said so. Whitmore interrupted only to clarify dates, names, and document numbers. Nothing about the investigator's voice revealed what he was thinking. Then Daniel mentioned the copied signatures. Everything changed. "Repeat that." Daniel explained again. His authentic reports had been altered after submission, while his signature remained attached to the revised versions. The investigator stopped him once more. "You have proof?" "I do." "Can you transmit it securely today?" "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. When Whitmore finally spoke, his tone had lost some of its professional distance. "Mr. Carter, how long were you employed there?" 12 years. "And they terminated you immediately after refusing to approve those reports?" "Yes." Paper shuffled on the other end of the line. Daniel heard pages turning, keyboard clicks, someone entering information quickly. Then came a question he hadn't expected. Did anyone ever tell you there was an active federal inquiry involving your company? No, I didn't think so. The investigator exhaled slowly. For legal reasons, there are limits to what I can discuss. Daniel waited. But I can tell you this. Whitmore's voice grew noticeably more deliberate. We've been examining financial irregularities connected to your company for 14 months. Daniel sat forward. 14 months. More than a year. Long before he lost his job. Long before Sophia contacted him. Long before he realized anything was wrong. The evidence you described fills a significant gap. Daniel looked down at the folders covering his table. What kind of gap? The one explaining why key records stopped matching internal financial reporting. For the first time during the conversation, Daniel felt the true scale of what he had stepped into. This wasn't a suspicion. It wasn't a workplace dispute. Federal investigators had already spent 14 months assembling pieces of a puzzle. Without realizing it, Daniel had been holding one of the missing pieces all along. Whitmore provided instructions for a secure evidence transfer. Within the hour, every document, timeline, email, and report had been uploaded and officially received. Confirmation arrived shortly afterward. Evidence accepted. Reference number assigned. Daniel stared at the message. Months of confusion suddenly felt different. Not resolved, but moving. Finally moving. Just before ending the call, Whitmore offered one final observation. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't reassuring. It was simply honest. Mr. Carter, people don't usually destroy records unless they're afraid of what's in them. The line disconnected. Daniel remained seated for several moments, listening to the quiet house around him. Outside, children were beginning to leave the nearby elementary school. Soon Emma would be home. Soon life would look ordinary again. But somewhere beyond the walls of his house, investigators were now reviewing evidence powerful enough to explain why executives had worked so hard to erase the truth. And if Whitmore was right, they had just lost the ability to hide it. The search warrants were executed at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning. Employees arriving for work expected another ordinary day of uncertainty. More rumors, more whispered conversations about layoffs, more carefully worded emails from leadership promising stability. Instead, they found unmarked government vehicles lining the front entrance. Men and women wearing dark jackets stepped to the revolving doors with folders tucked beneath their arms. They moved with quiet purpose, showing identification to reception before separating into teams that headed toward the executive floor, the finance department, and the record archive. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. Within minutes, the entire building understood something extraordinary was happening. On the 22nd floor, Richard Hawthorne had just begun presenting the company's recovery strategy to members of the board. A polished slideshow filled the conference room. Charts projected confidence. Revenue forecasts promised a return to growth. The layoffs, Richard assured everyone, had been difficult but necessary decisions made to protect the company's future. His presentation ended abruptly when the conference room doors opened. A woman in a navy blazer stepped inside, accompanied by 2 federal agents. Richard Hawthorne? Richard looked up, visibly irritated by the interruption. Yes. She handed him several pages. We're executing a federal search warrant. Effective immediately, all electronic devices, financial records, compliance files, and communication logs covered under this order are to remain exactly where they are. The room fell still. Board members exchanged confused glances. Mark Ellis slowly lowered the tablet he had been reviewing. Richard scanned the first page. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. For the first time in years, the man who always seemed to have an answer found none. One director leaned forward. "Richard, what is this?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The lead investigator addressed the room instead. Our investigation concerns suspected financial fraud, falsification of corporate records, and retaliation against a protected whistleblower. Several heads turned toward Richard. Others looked at Mark. The word seemed impossible to connect with the company they believed they knew. Retaliation, whistleblower, financial fraud. The polished image carefully built over decades began cracking in a matter of seconds. Across the building, Federal teams secured file rooms before anyone could remove another document. Computer servers were isolated. Backup drives were cataloged. Employees were instructed to leave their workstations untouched while investigators photographed offices and collected evidence. In the finance department, one manager quietly pushed back from his desk and covered his face with both hands. He understood before anyone else. It was over. Hundreds of miles away, Daniel sat in the waiting area of another job interview. His phone vibrated repeatedly inside his jacket pocket. One notification, then another, then 10 more. He excused himself and stepped into the hallway. Every alert carried the same story. Federal agents raid headquarters of National Logistics Company. Executives under investigation for fraud. Whistleblower retaliation alleged an expanding federal probe. Daniel stared at the headlines without opening them. A week earlier, no one outside the company knew his name. Now the truth had escaped the walls where it had been buried for months. Back at headquarters, investigators opened a secure evidence case labeled with Daniel's reference number. His original inspection reports were placed beside the altered versions recovered from company servers. Every forged signature matched. Every deleted safety violation reappeared. Every timeline aligned with internal emails authorizing revisions after Daniel had submitted the originals. What had once looked like isolated irregularities became a single, unmistakable pattern. The layoffs had never been a response to market conditions. They had been part of a coordinated effort to remove the one manager whose honesty threatened to expose years of deception. James Whitmore entered the executive conference room, carrying another folder. He placed it in front of the board without ceremony. The employee terminated during your restructuring, he said, became the government's most credible witness the moment your company attempted to silence him. No one spoke. Several directors turned slowly toward Richard. One of them, a man who had defended every restructuring proposal over the previous year, finally broke the silence. You told us he was redundant. Richard's shoulders sagged for the first time. He wasn't. The admission barely rose above a whisper. Outside the building, television cameras gathered behind police barriers as reporters delivered live updates. Investors reacted within minutes. The company's stock price plunged as trading volumes surged, erasing hundreds of millions of dollars in market value before the closing bell. Inside the offices, employees watched the news on their phones in stunned silence. The rumors, the resignations, the missing files, the security escorts, the hurried layoffs, the executives' refusal to answer simple questions. Every unexplained moment suddenly fit together. Daniel had never been fired because the company could no longer afford him. He had been fired because they believed no one would ever believe him. That was the mistake from which the company would never recover. The resignations began before the arrests. By sunrise the following morning, Richard Hawthorne's executive biography had disappeared from the company's website. Mark Ellis's corporate email account had been deactivated. Internal directories listed both men as being on administrative leave, while the board conducted what it called an independent review. No one inside the building believed that explanation anymore. By noon, the board issued another statement. Richard Hawthorne, Mark Ellis, and 3 senior executives had been formally removed from their positions pending criminal proceedings related to financial fraud, falsification of corporate records, and retaliation against a protected whistleblower. The announcement spread across every major business network within minutes. For employees who had spent months questioning their own instincts, the statement brought an unexpected kind of relief. They hadn't imagined the missing files. They hadn't misunderstood the sudden layoffs. The truth had finally become public. Daniel watched the press conference from the living room while Emma finished a puzzle on the floor. She glanced toward the television. "Is that your old office?" He muted the volume before answering. "It used to be. Are you going back?" Daniel looked at the familiar building on the screen. Federal investigators were still entering and leaving through the front doors. "I don't think so." Emma nodded, as though that answer made perfect sense. "That's okay." She picked up another puzzle piece. "You'll find somewhere better." Daniel smiled. "I hope you're right." "I know I am." Later that afternoon, James Whitmore called with an update. "The board has begun cooperating." "What changed?" "They've seen the evidence." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "And They're no longer trying to defend the executives. That wasn't surprising. What came next was someone else has agreed to cooperate as well. Who? Vanessa Brooks. Daniel was silent for a moment. The image of the HR director sliding the termination envelope across the conference table came rushing back. Why now? According to her attorney, she repeatedly warned leadership that terminating you after compliance disputes could be interpreted as retaliation. Daniel frowned. She never said that to me. She says she should have. Whitmore paused before continuing. She's providing meeting notes, internal emails, and records that investigators hadn't recovered. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Vanessa hadn't stopped what happened, but she had finally stopped protecting the people responsible. Sometimes that was where accountability began. Over the following weeks, more pieces fell into place. Employees who had quietly resigned returned to speak with investigators. Managers once afraid to answer Daniel's phone calls now gave detailed statements describing altered reports, unusual instructions, and pressure from senior leadership to remain silent. Each testimony strengthened the case. Each one made it harder for anyone to dismiss the fraud as the work of a single executive. The culture itself had been built on fear. Now that fear was breaking, the company, under its newly appointed interim leadership, announced a compensation program for employees affected by the fraudulent restructuring. Former workers who had lost their jobs received financial settlements, restored benefits, and assistance finding new employment. For many families, the money couldn't erase months of uncertainty, but it offered a chance to begin again. Daniel accepted the settlement only after reading every page himself, not because he distrusted the process, because he had learned how easily words could be changed after a signature was added. A few days later, another announcement appeared. The company formally withdrew every document that had implied Daniel's termination was performance-related. His personnel file was corrected. The altered compliance reports bearing his copied signature were declared fraudulent. A public statement acknowledged that Daniel Carter had repeatedly acted in accordance with company policy and ethical reporting standards. His professional reputation, damaged in silence, was restored just as publicly. Friends who hadn't called in weeks began reaching out. Former colleagues apologized for disappearing. Tom was one of the first. "I wanted to call sooner," he admitted over coffee. "I was scared." Daniel stirred his cup quietly. "I know. I should have done more." "You've done something now." Tom looked puzzled. "You told the truth." For the first time since losing his job, neither man had anything left to hide. That evening, Daniel tucked him into bed as he had every night since she was born. She looked up at him sleepily. "You seem happier." "I think I am." "Did you fix it?" Daniel thought about the question. The investigations weren't over. The court cases still lay ahead. Some wounds would take years to heal. But something important had changed. He kissed her forehead. "I'm working on building something better." Emma smiled, satisfied with the answer. As Daniel quietly switched off the bedroom light, he realized he no longer measured victory by what Richard Hawthorne had lost. He measured it by what Emma had never lost. Her belief that doing the right thing was always worth the cost. 6 months later, Daniel Carter no longer drove past his former office. He didn't need to. The building that had once consumed so much of his life had become just another stretch of glass and concrete on the evening news, where updates now focus on court hearings, shareholder lawsuits, and criminal proceedings that continued long after the headlines had faded. Richard Hawthorne and Mark Ellis appeared only occasionally, entering federal courthouses through crowds of waiting reporters. The confidence that had once defined them had disappeared beneath the weight of consequences they could no longer control. Daniel rarely watched. He had spent enough time looking backward. Every morning now began somewhere entirely different. The headquarters of his new employer was smaller than his previous company, but the atmosphere felt unmistakably different. People greeted one another by name. Managers walked the warehouse floor instead of observing it through conference room windows. Safety meetings were treated as priorities rather than interruptions, and questions were welcomed instead of quietly discouraged. During Daniel's final interview months earlier, the company's president had asked him only one question about the investigation. "If doing the right thing cost you everything once," she had said, "would you still make the same decision?" Daniel hadn't needed time to think. "Yes." He was offered the position before the interview ended. Now, as director of operations, he found himself encouraging younger managers to challenge decisions that didn't feel right. If something doesn't make sense, he often told them, bring it forward. Problems become expensive when people are afraid to speak. No one looked uncomfortable hearing those words. They nodded. They asked questions. They participated. For the first time in years, Daniel worked in a place where integrity wasn't treated as an obstacle. It was part of the job description. One Friday afternoon, the company gathered employees in the warehouse for its quarterly meeting. There were no elaborate presentations, no dramatic speeches. The president stepped onto a small platform and smiled toward Daniel. Before we finish today, she said, there's one person we'd like to recognize. Daniel immediately felt dozens of eyes turned toward him. He wasn't fond of public attention. Still, he walked forward. The president handed him a simple glass award. Across the front were just a few engraved words. Leadership through integrity. No mention of profits. No sales figures. No production records. Just the quality that had nearly cost him everything. The room filled with applause. Standing near the back, wearing her favorite blue dress, the same one she'd worn for her school presentation months earlier, Emma clapped harder than anyone. She had insisted on attending after school, saying she wanted to see Dad's new work. When Daniel stepped down from the platform, she ran over and hugged him tightly. I told you. He laughed softly. Told me what? You'd find somewhere better. I guess you were right. I usually am. Her grin made several nearby employees laugh. One of them leaned over and whispered, She's definitely your boss. Daniel smiled. She'd probably agree. On the drive home, the award rested carefully on the passenger seat, while Emma talked excitedly about weekend plans. Halfway through conversation, she became unusually quiet. Dad. Yeah. Are you glad they fired you? The question lingered between them. Months earlier, he would have answered without hesitation. Now it deserved more thought. I'm not glad it happened, he said honestly. It hurt. Emma nodded. But if it hadn't happened, I might never have found this place. She looked out the window as neighborhoods slipped past. And the bad people? They're being held responsible. So the good guys won? Daniel smiled at the simplicity of childhood. Not exactly. What do you mean? The good guys just refused to stop doing the right thing. Emma seemed to think about that for a while before quietly saying, I like that better. When they reached home, she carried the glass award inside with both hands, as though it were something priceless. She placed it carefully on the living room bookshelf beside an old framed photograph. In the picture, Daniel stood between Emma and Sarah on a windy beach years before illness had changed their lives. Sand clung to their shoes, and all three were laughing at something the camera hadn't captured. The award reflected softly against the glass of the photograph. For a moment, the past and the present seemed to share the same space. Daniel realized then that titles had changed. Companies had changed. Even the future he once imagined had changed. But the values Sarah had admired, the lessons Emma was beginning to understand, and the choices that defined a person's character had remained untouched by every attempt to erase them. Richard Hawthorne had sacrificed his reputation trying to protect power that was never meant to last. Daniel Carter had lost a career, but gained something no courtroom, corporation, or executive could ever take away. Each night, when Emma looked at her father, she saw a man who had chosen honesty when silence would have been easier. That quiet certainty became the greatest inheritance he could ever leave her, because paychecks end, job titles disappear, buildings are sold, companies rise and fall. But a life built on truth has a way of outlasting all of them.